You remember our venerable house, opulent and imperial. It is a festering abomination. I beg you, return home, claim your birthright, and deliver our family from the ravenous, clutching shadows of the darkest dungeon.
The Howard Lovecraft series is the worst trilogy of animated films that I have seen in my life. Yet before we dig into this dish of poorly lit madness, there is quite the story behind this weird trilogy. These films are in fact an adaptation of another trilogy of graphic novels by Bruce Brown and Renzo Podesta that ran from 2009 to 2013 with a hardcover compilation book released in 2014. 2 years later, on October 2016, the first animated adaptation was released. It was produced by Arcana Studios and Shout Factory, both Canadian-based companies. It should also be noted that Arcana Studios is also the same company that published the graphic novels in the first place. Naturally, the studio was inclined to adapt its own IPs for the small screen. While I can't speak to how well it captured the comic story, I can definitely say that the visuals are a far cry from what I saw in the comic preview. Starting with some good points on the visuals, the characters are competently modeled and rigged. However, their animation is very stiff, with the vast majority of characters barely emoting or acting, which makes for very boring scenes where the characters do little but talk to each other. Which wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't 60% of the films. The next thing to note about the series is that they look like early PS2 game FMVs. The texturing is very rough. At best, it lacks the physical characteristics of whatever material it's trying to ape, and at worst, it clashes heavily with the character materials, creating a heavy clash of visuals. What's worse is that the lighting is horrible. Let me explain a little bit. The most basic setup for lighting in cinema is the 3-light setup. We have the key light, which is the brightest and defines the shadows in the film. Then there's the fill light, which controls how dark the shadows are. In cinema, it's usually pointed against the shadows cast by the key light, but in 3D animation, all you need to do is put in something like an Omni light and crank the intensity up or down. Super simple. Some scenes, if they have this, they don't use it enough, or in some scenes, they have it cranked up to absolute maximum, if they used it at all. One light that I know they neglected is the rim light, or as it's sometimes called, the backlight. This particular light helps you define the back of the subject that the camera is focusing on, making it pop out of the background. When used correctly and intentionally, you can set the mood, draw attention to key points in the film, or cover up your high school level texturing. What's worse is that in the first 2 films, the lighting isn't even consistent between shots in the same location, meaning that they separated the shots into separate files, but neglected to make sure the lighting was consistent in all shots of the scene. There is only so much that being low budget can excuse in this series. If you think that maybe the films might have some redeeming parts in terms of story or characters, then I'm sorry to disappoint because there is nothing but repetitive plots, excessive amounts of exposition, and voice actors that are way above this film's scope. Seriously, they got Mark Hamill in the second and third film. It boggles my mind. What's also strange is how they managed to repeat the overall plot 3 times over for each film, with some details varying. If you don't believe me, well, let's just give a brief overview of the entire trilogy, because I've already suffered through this, and by goodness, you'll hear just how bad they are. The first film, Howard Lovecraft and the Frozen Kingdom. The film starts out with Howard visiting his dad at the asylum, and gets one scene that comes close to horror, but instead of anything happens, he just gets the dad's book. Back at home, Howard reads the book and gets isekai'd into a forgotten PS2 ice level where he meets Totally Not Cthulhu. They call him Spot, I am calling him Cthulhu. They frolic about in the snow and meet some pointless squid kids that do nothing but exposit at Howard. They reach the city of Relay, which looks like rejected Morrowind assets. They meet the totally not the villain Algid Bunk, who exposits more at us for another 10 minutes. Howard goes to retrieve another of his dad's journals that's kept by a Shoggoth that looks absolutely nothing like a Shoggoth. They come back to the town only to find out that Algid Bunk was actually Abdul Al-Hazred, the main villain of the first two films. Abdul uses the book to take control of Cthulhu, but Howard gets through to him by the power of Phaser! Howard promptly raffle stomps Abdul. Cthulhu sends Howard back home, where he tells his dad he solved the problem. Film 2. Howard Lovecraft and the Undersea Kingdom. The film starts out with Howard having a dream of him swimming underwater like a fish person, but he is interrupted by Cthulhu's astral projected head. Fortunately, Abdul is back and is eager to fulfill Howard's wet dream by kidnapping his parents and cursing him to become a deep one if he fails to bring him the third journal, so that he can complete Stanford Pine's machine. I mean, make the Necronomicon, which will allow him to fully awaken Cthulhu. Again. Thankfully, Cthulhu teleports Howard to safety, but gets captured in his astral form. Howard winds up at the Miskatonic University and meets Mark Hamill, who thankfully is privy to occult knowledge that can help Howard. He helps Howard break his father out of Abdul's grasp and teaches the boy how to use the Force. I mean, use the Keyblade. I mean, how to cast spells without needing to roll for sanity damage. After that, Howard and Cthulhu go through a bunch of pointless trials that guard the third journal. He then fuses them to craft the Necronomicon. Abdul gets ruffle stomped by Dagon, who was just kind of there because they were on his home world. Also, he does the curse on himself and his mom. Film 3. Howard Lovecraft and the Kingdom of Madness. The third entry begins with Howard messing around with the Necronomicon, an action that certainly will not have any terrible consequences in the near future. As it turns out, his uncle, who is totally not Howard from the future, has come to visit for his birthday. Suddenly, night gaunts start appearing out of rifts between reality because somebody's been messing with the fabric of time and space. I wonder who that could be! Confused, everybody goes to see Professor Hamill to get a lecture on what just happened. After meeting some of the professor's colleagues, and the most boring exposition dump of the entire trilogy, then everyone hops on an airship to Mr. Lovecraft's lab in Antarctica at the swift speed of 15 miles per hour. We get a flashback of how Mr. Lovecraft discovered how to travel between worlds and fell out with his old lab partner who has very little bearing on the plot. When they reach the lab, they get attacked by elder things for no good reason, and Howard quickly magics them away using dark magic, something that he was cautioned not to do because, again, fabric of reality's tearing apart and nobody seems to really care about it. When the group finally reaches the portal that was underneath the lab, suddenly Howard's uncle turns on the party and takes control of Cthulhu, who just kind of showed up because the plot demanded it. They have one of the most protracted battle scenes that I've ever seen that ultimately results in Howard getting kidnapped by his uncle, who then reveals that he is, wait for it, Howard from the future. Didn't see that one coming now, did ya? He then gives the Necronomicon to Nyarlathotep and explains why he did it. As it turns out, he struck a deal with Nyarlathotep that he would be able to possess the young Lovecraft and live out his old childhood. Young Howard manages to convince his future self that this is a bad idea because reality is about to end. So the two of them head back to Relay for the most anticlimactic climactic battle. Like the other three films, Howard gets Cthulhu to stop being stupid via power of heart and friendship, Nyarlathotep is defeated, future Lovecraft returns to World War II, and the trilogy comes to an utterly boring end. This trilogy was an absolute slog. The animation may be bad, but it loses its novelty fast because of how utterly dull the story is. The pacing is slow, which is exacerbated with the host of scenes that do nothing but exposit for the audience. It's not entertaining as a kid's film, and it's nowhere near visually strong enough to be in any way an adaptation of the comic, never mind something that wears Lovecraft on its title. Then there's the mere fact that someone thought that Lovecraft would work as kids' media. Even if you do sidestep the racist themes of Lovecraft's work, there is the fact that he still primarily wrote horror, and frankly, the only horrific thing about these films is how dated the animation looks. That will do it for the Howard Lovecraft Trilogy. If you want to see more of this content, subscribe to the channel and like the video because all your feedback matters. If you have got any suggestions for my mainline design dungeon, or if you want me to cover something in more of a video essay like this, leave a comment suggesting the media below. I'll be seeing you all next time.
Is that a fucking floating tree? What the PlayStation 1 bullshit is this? Oh, fuck.